I am here with Eric Asimov. It is July 28th, 2017 in Nicholson Library. My name is Stephanie Hofmann. And the first question we'll start off with is, why wine?
Well, I'm very privileged to be able to have anything to do with wine. I'm a journalist, and but I've been in love with wine longer than I've been a journalist. I discovered it when I was a teenager, when I discovered food. And at the time, it never occurred to me that I would be able to professionally have anything to do with wine and food. But as things turned out, I was a failed academic and needed a job and thought I could get a job in journalism, and I did. And I was hired by the New York Times shortly after I had my first job, and I was in national news. And it wasn't, journalism for me was not a passionate love affair, but food and wine was. And in my spare time, I thought maybe I could write some food and wine stories for our food section, and because I was not on their staff, they would pay me extra. So there was a financial incentive to do that as well. And that's how I began writing about food and wine at the Times, and within a few years I was doing that full time.
So to you, what makes wine special? Why do you write about it? Or why do you like to write about it?
Well, there are so many different levels to wine. First of all is just the deliciousness and the pleasure of wine. It makes a meal better. It makes it more convivial. It encourages friendship, encourages conversation, and that's just a beginning. Because for me, although what's in the glass is a pleasure and is fascinating, it's in some ways the least interesting part of wine. The stories that go with wine, the people who make it, the place where it comes from, the politics and economics of the wine business, the aesthetic debates that go on all the time. These are all fascinating. But I think most exciting to me is to think of wine as an expression of culture, particularly in the old world, where wine is a product of a community, and it has been for centuries. And in the same way that communities created recipes for their food or songs or dances, they created wine as a form of expression. And to see how that continues today is fascinating to me. And you would think that in our modern connected internet world, there wouldn't be so much else to discover. But I kind of feel like all I do is explore, or much of what I do is explore and discover wines that nobody ever heard of 20 years ago are available all around the world today. I mean, it's really the greatest time in history to be a wine lover. And if you're open to everything that's available, it's just a never-ending sense of discovery. And that's not even, the new vintage that comes through every year, the different interaction between the human touch and the place and the climate. There's just so much going on that it's interesting and it's always a challenge to write about. Before I've been the wine critic at the New York Times since 2004. Before I did that, I reviewed restaurants for many years. And just as a writing form, for me, the restaurant review is very limiting. You know, it's a challenge to figure out how to operate within those limits. But the wine writing is much more free form. There are just many more different areas to cover and to write about.
So how do you decide, with so many different things that are involved with not only the actual product of wine or what comes from it, how do you decide what to write about?
I want to, certainly I want to offer a consumer service in helping people get to know wine better. And I want to write about things that interest me. And I would like to feel that I have very wide-ranging interests in wine so that I'm not always very narrowly focused. But, you know, it has to be interesting to me. That said, there are so many different sorts of wines from so many different kinds of places and so many different kinds of stories that I never really feel at a loss. In fact, the problem is with a column that appears once a week, how do I fit in everything I want to write about?
So you kind of mentioned this a little bit, but what are some of the challenges of writing about wine, and what are your favorite parts about it?
You know, challenges are maybe personal, and it's hard to say. I mean, I think I have the greatest job in the world, and I'm privileged to work for a place like the New York Times and to write about a subject that I care about as much as wine. And so it doesn't feel like work to me. All the time I spend doing my job is fun. So, you know, the challenges are the challenges I think that any writer faces. You know, procrastination, deadlines, you know, trying to figure out how to do something that's not formulaic. Maybe one of the challenges that I faced earlier on was overcoming the both conventional wisdom and the conventional sense of how one was to write about wine. And these are very powerful in wine because many of the experiences that we have with wine are vicarious. You know, we can't all have old Grand Cru Burgundy. We can't all visit the regions, and so we rely on, or people in general rely a lot on textbooks. And for me, early on, it took me a little while, and I needed some experience to realize that a lot of what is repeated and accepted was really old thinking, you know, 19th century, 20th century conventional wisdom in the 21st century, where it really wasn't true anymore. And so it took a while to learn that, you know, you can't rely on what somebody else has said, no matter how authoritative. A lot of things you have to find out for yourself, and you have to be able to see the difference between what an authority has said and what you see, and then be able to go with your own experience. That's one thing. The other thing has been to overcome the notion that in the 1990s and the early part of this century, in this country, that the only way to write about wine was to write tasting notes. And to me, tasting notes have always been counterproductive. They don't tell you how a wine tastes. They are useful as sort of individual mnemonic devices. If I can write some notes so I can remember my own experience of this wine. But if you were to compare, and I did this for a book I wrote, if you were to compare tasting notes from different critics about the same wine, they're totally different. So what does it mean? What does it mean when one person says strawberry and the next person says gooseberry and the third person says fig compote? It doesn't really mean anything. So I wanted to think of a better way to communicate about wine, and the first thing I realized for myself is that describing all those aromas and flavors is really the least interesting thing you can do. It just makes it sound as if you know what you're talking about. And really, it's if you're going to be talking about a particular wine, you have to speak more generally. You can talk about the structure, you can talk about the acidity or sweetness, hopefully not using those jargon or industry terms, but you can put it in more accessible terms. But there are other ways to inspire people to be interested in wine by telling the story of people, places, the role wine has had in their culture, how things have developed as they have, and also to talk about my own experiences, not as a role model, but hopefully just as inspiration in the sense of this is the way one person experiences wine joyfully and with great pleasure and with curiosity.
So what would you say is if you have one, your wine writing or just writing philosophy? Maybe it sounds a little bit grandiose to say I have a wine writing philosophy, but I just try to write as clearly, with a minimum of jargon, hopefully at least a little bit entertaining, and really, I want to be as down to earth as possible. I think, specifically about wine again, maybe, and this is possibly true, possibly diminishing now. There's a lot of wine anxiety in this country. People find wine intimidating, and that's not news. But they do. And why do they find it intimidating? And my theory has to do with scores and tasting notes. People read the way experts talk about wine. They say in tasting notes, and then they drink the wine, and it's not the way they experience it. So they think there's something wrong with them. They don't have the right equipment. They don't have the capability to understand wine. And then they look at scores, and at least in years past, the bigger, more powerful, fruitier wines would get higher scores, and the leaner, fresher wines wouldn't. And this is really
a stylistic judgment more than anything else by the critics then. And most people, I think, if they're just at home on a Tuesday night and they're just eating with family, and that the lean, fresh wine is always going to be better than the bigger, powerful wine, but the bigger, powerful wine was scored higher. So again, people say, "Oh, well, I guess I just don't understand wine. It's not. I don't have the capability to do it." And they kind of throw up their hands. And so I want to be able to speak to people and encourage them to enjoy wine for themselves, not to think about how wine is supposed to taste, but to taste it for themselves and not worry about there being right answers or wrong answers. And I want them to understand that there's no such thing as the best wine. And the 100-point scale, which puts everything on a single universal scale, is extremely misleading, because wine it has to be understood in context. You can't have a single best wine, but you can have a good wine for the occasion, the best wine for the occasion. And sometimes that calls for a wine that's not going to be rated as highly by critics, and so we have to put that thinking aside and start thinking about wine in a different way. What is the occasion? Who am I with? What is the food? What's a good wine for this moment?
So for people that aren't that experienced in wine, maybe they do have this wine anxiety, and how would you tell them to start to get into not just the Barefoots of the world, but getting into more finer wines? Like, how would you tell them to start doing that?
Well, that's a good question, and I started a column in 2014 called Wine School. And this is based on an idea I had long before high-speed internet, where the best way to learn about wine, if you are new to wine, somewhat new to wine, is not to buy a book, not to take a class, not to get a wine magazine, but to find a good wine shop. And go to that wine shop, buy a mixed case of wine, bring them home. Over the course of whatever period, it's a month, 2 months, drink those wines with dinner with your family, and keep track of what you liked and what you didn't like. And when you're done with that case, go back and get another mixed case, but tell the wine merchant, here's the last case I bought, this is what I liked, this is what I didn't like. You can even conjecture to think about why, and do it again. And over time, patterns emerge. You get a sense of what you like and what you don't, and why. And this is the beginning of developing your own taste, which I think is the most important thing that people can do. So years later, now we have high-speed internet, and people can actually have a conversation very easily online. And I thought, well, maybe we can put this into practice. So each month now, I suggest a certain sort of wine for people to buy, and I give them a few examples, and they go out and get the wines, and over the course of a month, drink the wine, and they talk about it in the comments section, they talk about it in emails to me, they talk about it in emails to each other. People have gotten together, they have tasting groups. It's been sort of international, and Canada, Japan, Europe, China, and it's really interesting because people on the one hand have been trying wines that they might not have thought that they would like. They're trying wines that they're pretty sure they don't like, and we're all learning something together. And people are it's now been about 3 years that we've been doing it. It has problems because in this country, you can't always find the wines that I'm recommending, and certainly in different parts of the country, it's all the selections are different. But it's been really successful in getting people to try new things and to make up their own mind about what they think about the wine, and not, think of it only in terms of what a critic said. And so, this subversive idea, which is just, it's kind of a pipe dream, but the idea is to get people to rely on themselves so they don't need people to tell them what they should drink.
So you write about this often, you've kind of talked about it a little bit, but why do you think we should talk about wine as food and with food?
Well, this is all part of feeling comfortable with wine. That's the first part. I've suggested thinking of wine as food because it's disarming to think of wine as just another staple of the table. It's like bread or rice or other things that we just have, and we don't have to gear ourselves up to drink it. It's not we don't have there's not a drama when you go to a restaurant of ordering the hamburger, but the bottle of wine is a tense moment for a lot of people. So it's partly just to think of it as an ordinary part of life, take it down from a pedestal, and wine can be very special, as can any other food, but it doesn't have to be. It can also be ordinary in the best sense of the word. The second reason is that we've become very conscious of how we eat in this country. More and more people, they want to know where their food comes from. Was it grown organically? Was it raised humanely? Is it local? Is it this sort of thing? And people who care about the healthfulness and the ethics of what they eat forget about the wine, which can be as manipulated and processed as food that they prefer not to eat. So I think that there's definitely a correlation between minimal processing for wine, just as I do for food. And if people were able to ask for this in their wines, it would immediately improve the quality of what they drink. It's not, that's not to say that all wines that are minimally processed are all good. There's still a whole range of styles and competencies among the winemakers, but the chances are you're going to drink better wine than you are if you're buying, something that comes from a tank farm and sold in a supermarket. And then the third thing, aside from better wine, the joy of wine is that it's changeable. You don't know what you're going to get. This has occasional downsides. Maybe you get a bottle that's not in the best condition, or it's not the best time to drink it. But the joys of that far outweigh the disadvantages. You're getting something that's alive, that evolves, that's complex, and this is what wine lovers live for. The stuff that's processed maximally is essentially a shelf-stable soft drink that has been designed and manufactured to meet specifications, and to me, that's not what makes wine interesting. It's just a alcohol delivery system.
So what region, what vintage, or what varietal makes you the most excited?
Well, I mean, I can't be that narrowly focused because I've got like a whole bunch of stories to do. But I'm first of all, I'm so excited by the new wines that I have found in the last 10 years, whether it's a Sirtico from the Greek island of Santorini, the wonderful wines coming from Sicily and other southern Italian regions, dry ferment from Hungary, Slovenia, all of these areas in the old world that have been making wine for centuries, but were never discovered. They just wine that was just sold locally, essentially, that's now available and is just another option, another good option. And I'm also really excited in our own country how things have been evolving in the last 10 years or so. We've gone from a place that was somewhat monochrome in style, particularly in California, but I'm not omitting Oregon from that, to wine regions that have a far greater diversity of styles and flavors and options for consumers, and I think this is a wonderful thing. I also think that in the country we're much more conscious of wine expressing a sense of place, of being able to go with food, a freshness in wine, and less concern with achieving scores, although it's still important for some people. And I think, all over the world where there has been this monochromatic style, whether it was in Australia, at least among the wines that we were able to get here, Spain, South America, you're just seeing far more experimentation and individuation and diversity, and that makes me very excited.
Well, since you are in Oregon right now, you obviously have experienced the industry firsthand and the wines here. What do you think of the Oregon wine industry?
I think it's great. I think I'm so impressed over the last 10 years by the elevation of quality here. This has to do with certainly with Pinot Noir, where the diversity of styles, as I said, is far greater. But the Chardonnay has gotten really good in Oregon. And I'm not sure if that is just a question of selecting better clones, as some people have suggested, or simply that winemakers have more experience and more confidence in what they're doing. But it's the improvement is notable. And then the third thing that I find fascinating is the amount of experimentation that's been going on. Most obviously, the people who are making Gamay, which is, I think it's really good. But, I've been speaking with growers who have dozens of different grapes in their vineyard. Not because they think that Pinot Noir isn't the signature grape, the red grape of the Willamette Valley, but because it's not the only narrative that Oregon has to tell right now. Oregon, Pinot Noir and Chardonnay, and so I've tasted Ferment and Aligoté and Gruner Veltliner and Nebbiolo and Dolcetto, and not all of them are successful, but some of them are really interesting, and it's worth this experimentation is important because you need more flavors than the leading flavor. Oregon Pinot Noir has gotten to a point where the good ones are kind of expensive, and people need things to drink when they're not willing to spend $60 a bottle or whatever. And I don't think the answer is like knockoff expensive Pinot Noir, although I've had some excellent $20 Pinots from the Willamette. It's finding other grapes that maybe can be grown in areas that are not as valuable, where you don't have to charge as much. And that's always a difficult proposition for American producers who, by nature, we all want to make the best. And so if Pinot Noir is considered the best or among the elite grapes, that's where people want to go. It's harder to say, maybe you don't want to make the best wine in the world. Maybe you just want to make the best wine from your plot of earth. And maybe your plot of earth can make really good Gamay or something else. And it's a process that takes a long time. And Oregon's wine industry is what, about less than 50 years old. And that's a fraction of the time. It took 1,000 years for the monks to decide where to put the grapes in Burgundy, or where the best places were. So it's an enormous amount has been accomplished in that time here in Oregon.
Talking a little bit more about Pinot Noir, in the book Passion for Pinot, we wrote the foreword. You said no matter which new clones of Pinot Noir are planted in which types of soil, monitored by which type of gauges, or transformed into wine by which sort of contraptions, Pinot Noir will always have its way. What did you mean about that?
I mean that it is among red grapes, perhaps the most transparent grape. And if you plant it in the wrong place, or care for it in the wrong way, it's not going to do what you want it to do. It's going to do what it wants to do. And so you have to be very careful with Pinot Noir. The place matters, the climate matters, the way you transform it into wine matters, and all of these things have given it a reputation as a very kind of delicate, needy grape. And I don't know if ultimately it deserves that reputation, but it's definitely sensitive.
You were in the Grand Seminar earlier today, and it was all about the French influence and people from France making wine in Oregon. Can you talk a little bit about that French influence and how it's shaped the Oregon wine industry, or that relationship?
Well, by French influence, we're really talking about the Burgundian influence, and the power of Burgundy is such that it's kind of the archetype for the wine region that almost every other place in the world wants to be. Making small lots of wine that are expressive of terroir, where you're you're both the grower and the winemaker, the vigneron, and that's been a evolution from, if you go back to like the 80s in Napa Valley, the model was Bordeaux, and you see much bigger estates with the grand kind of chateau-like visitor centers and things like that. So it's much different, and because Burgundy is so powerful, its influence can be very great for Pinot Noir producers. I mean, you have to come to terms with the example of Burgundy, but also with going your own way. And I think Oregon in particular has grappled with that really well. Partly because it's attracted Burgundians more so than other Pinot Noir regions, beginning with the Drouhin, and the Burgundians themselves have set the example of embracing the influence of Burgundy without trying to emulate it, knowing that this is a different place and you have to make a different kind of wine, but that there is this example for what the beauty of Pinot Noir can be, and Chardonnay for that matter, and that this is a sort of a benchmark for wines of finesse and grace and beauty, which is really what Pinot Noir and Chardonnay want to be. So you have a confluence of growers in Oregon, producers in Oregon, who are fascinated with Burgundy, and Burgundians who are fascinated with Oregon, so you have an opportunity for a lot of interchange there. And I think, it may be a little presumptuous of me to say, but I think that the Burgundians who have come here have been modest, in the sense that they have not come here to tell, the people how it's supposed to be done. They've been open to learning from the people who've been working in this area for much longer. And the people in Oregon have been open to what they can learn from their Burgundians who have been making such beautiful wine with the same grapes in their very different place. So it's been an opportunity for harmony and communication, and it seems as if that's worked out pretty well.
What are your thoughts on IPCN since you've been here 4 times? Just what do you think of it?
I think it's been a model wine festival. The times that I've been here, it's been really well organized. It's a beautiful campus here at Linfield. It's calm, it's leisurely, but it has its rigorous moments, and it's a great gathering of Pinot Noir producers from all over the wine world, and so I really enjoy it. And I mean, it shouldn't be lost on anybody that it was just a brilliant marketing device for the Oregon wine producers to bring all these people here and to have Oregon identified so tightly with Pinot Noir. I see people trying to emulate that in other parts of the world, like New Zealand now. So it's a combination of a great idea, a great educational opportunity for a lot of people, including me, especially me, and just a great time. And I should add to that, you happen to have here in the Willamette, because it's so near Portland. I mean, it's the rare wine region that is just so close, and you have a set of really interesting and generous and regionally minded chefs in Portland, that you really do the wine and food thing very well, and put them together in a way that is, I think, inspiring and conveys the message that wine and food belong together.
So going a little bit more broader now to the American wine industry and wine culture, what do you think, what is the wine culture in America right now?
I would say the wine culture in America is evolving. For a long time, we were novices, and we needed a lot of hand-holding. How do you drink wine? What do you serve particular wines with? Which wine do I choose? And this is where the scores and tasting notes came about, and the very sorts of elaborate guides, detailing the 4 ways or the dozen ways that you could determine which wine pairs with which food by this formula, or measuring acid level, all of these kind of crazy things. But when people start to become more comfortable with wine, and the generation that started reading Wine Spectator and Robert Parker in the early 80s now has their own kids who grew up with wine on the table, less hand-holding is needed. And so you have a different, I would like to think, more adult conversation where people are exchanging ideas about wine, and it's less directed to what you do with it. And it's interesting that you see it going on in other countries. You saw it in maybe 20 or 30 years ago, a little bit after it started here in the US. You saw it in Japan, and now in Japan people are far more confident in wine. You see it in China and other parts of Asia, and it's it's a reason why the Wine Advocate is putting much more of its effort into Asia, because there's a demand for that sort of hand-holding. So I think the American wine culture is evolved and having it just feels like a more adult sort of conversation. I feel in a large way that we've kind of left the culture wars of 10 years ago behind, or starting to. I mean, there's still a lot of raging about natural wines that goes on. But it just feels like a more grown-up situation, and now we can all enjoy wine as peers, rather than needing this top-down, I'm going to tell you what to do. Interestingly, in my opinion, in countries like France and Italy, where they grew up with wine and everybody is very comfortable with wine, they have to go through the same process because their comfort level was built on their lack of choice, in a way. Everybody just drank the local wine. That's what you drank. And maybe occasionally you got a fancy wine from Bordeaux or whatever, but there wasn't that much of an issue. Now they too are facing wider choices. Wine is on the table less often. It's a different kind of wine than it was 50 years ago. So there's a lot of, especially among younger people, they have begun to learn about wines like people in America or England or other countries.
And how do you think the younger people in America, some of them have grown up with wine on the table, as you said, but some of them haven't, and now they're getting to where they're able to purchase wine and purchase solely more expensive wines. How do you think they're going to take on? Do you think it's going to be the same way that you mentioned before with their knowledge of wine and wine culture, or do you think it's going to be different?
I think younger people are going to feel a lot more comfortable with wine than, say, people of my generation. More of them have grown up with wine, but they've also grown up with a much greater degree of discernment than say, I did. When I was a kid, it was a time of you had TV dinners, instant coffee. Beer was Budweiser or Miller, or there weren't that many options. Now, younger people have, there's far more consciousness of quality in food, far more choices about where you shop. There's people, they see their parents drinking craft beer. When they're old enough, they get interested in cocktails, and it's not like drinking screwdrivers out of a bottle. You're going to the lounge, and people there are, they've made their own tinctures and the real juices. So there's a much higher consciousness of quality in all things, and that applies to wine too. They understand that how to judge things. They may not know all the names and the places and the rigmarole that sometimes goes with wine, but they understand how to think about it and how to think about the occasion better. The only problem for young people, and it's a serious problem, is that a lot of good wines have gotten so expensive, and it's very sad that young people have virtually no chance to drink Grand Cru Burgundy, for example, unless they're wealthy or unless they know someone who's wealthy. And on the bright side, there are a lot of other great wines that they can drink now that are more affordable, but you want to be able to taste these historic wines just to create a context for understanding other wines, and I don't like the fact that a lot of wines are now luxury goods, bought or owned by people who really don't care about wine, but it's either status or investment or for some other reason than the love of wine.
Do you think that's going to change, or do you think wine is just going to keep getting more expensive?
I don't really see that changing. I mean, I don't see the demand for Burgundy crashing. It's very much like real estate, and forgive me, I'm going to get on my political soapbox for a moment, but when you have a great income disparity in the world, people with a lot of money can pay whatever it takes to get what they want, whether it's an apartment in Manhattan or London, or the best car, or the best watch, or the best bottle of wine. And because there's no relationship between value and cost, because they have so much money, they end up with a disproportionate amount, and the price goes up for everybody. And as long as we have that disparity, I don't ever see it changing in wine. I just see more wines going in that direction. And of course, the demand is so much greater. Once you've introduced great wines, Burgundy, which is in such short supply, to Asia and other parts of the world, there's just not enough to go around.
Do you think wine regions that are like New World wine regions, like the Americas and like New Zealand, do you think the wines there are going to start trying to get up to that price range, like maybe not at that expensive, but keep going up, or do you think they're going to try to stay closer to the people that can buy it?
Well, I think I think most producers will want to get what they think their wine is worth, and it's not really up to the producers. Although, I think the first sparkling wine in California, for example, there was a sparkling wine in California that was the price was set at above $100, and why? Because that's what Krug charges, and we think our wines are among the best in the world. So there's a natural elevation. But then you can't blame producers for getting whatever they want, because if a wine is in short supply, Domaine de la Romanée-Conti could say, this is ridiculous that people are paying $800 for a bottle of our Échezeaux. We're going to charge $100 for it. Well, the people who buy those wines for $100 are just going to turn around and sell them for $800. So they're not going to be available to more people. It's just that the profits will go to middle people rather than to the producers, and that doesn't feel right to me. I don't really have a solution, and I don't. It's not really. It's really the market that sets the price.
And then you talked a little bit about the future of the wine culture in America. Do you have any thoughts on the future of the actual industry, of the people who produce the wine in America? What is in the future for them?
I have hopes. Yeah. I hope that we can maintain as many small production wineries as possible. There's been a lot of buying up by big corporations of brands, and most likely that's not going to stop anytime soon, because it's a real incentive to be able to cash out of your business, particularly if you don't have an heir or somebody who is willing and able to take it over. So I hope that we can maintain a balance between big producers and small family producers. I'm not saying that small family producers always make better wine, but I would say that chances are they have fewer obstacles in their way to making better wine than big corporate producers. And I do believe that the quality of wine is going to get better and better. You're going to see wine from more and more places in the U.S. You know, we have great wines from the Finger Lakes of New York that 20 years ago nobody would have predicted. Rieslings from Michigan, very good. I think the wines are going to get better from Texas. I've had good wines from New Mexico, from Idaho. So, you know, I think we, you know, we'll be surprised at where wine is coming from, you know, maybe 25 years from now. I've had good wine from New Jersey and Pennsylvania, Virginia, you know, it goes on. I think that part of that would happen if people just think about what would be the best wine from their place rather than competing with the best wines in the world. But, you know, that's just my view.
And do you have any different hopes for the Oregon wine industry, or is it kind of the same for your American industry hopes?
I would say it's the same thing, but I really hope in Oregon that that people continue with experimentation. I mean, we've established that you can make brilliant Pinot Noir and Chardonnay in the Willamette Valley, but I want to know what else you can get from Oregon. I've had, you know, I mentioned the Gamay, good Gewürztraminer from the Columbia Gorge. There's so many possibilities, and I'm just really eager to see how it turns out. You know, I've told my kids I don't plan on dying because the story is too interesting, story of life, and you know, yeah, I'm basically always curious about the future, and I want to see what happens.
Well, that's all the questions we have for you. Do you have anything else that you want to say?
No, I think we've covered a lot of ground. So thank you for giving me the opportunity.
Yeah, thank you so much for sitting down with us and answering these questions.
My pleasure.